Hello everyone. So this is a quick introduction to the instructional design process. Basically the concept we're going to talk about here is the information we covered on chapter 1, except is going to be complements of what you already read. So the first things that we need to consider when we are doing instructional design or when we are talking about designing training. So I'm going to refer to that activity either one of the terms. Essentially, we have to consider the visual appeal, and this is not necessarily in a specific order, but I believe that there is a reason why we always need to keep this in mind. So the visual appeal, how have you heard the phrase, everything enters through the eyes? We have to make sure that, of course, if we're creating something visual, there is an appeal for it. And even if it's something that people are going to experience, they also have to find an appeal for it. And so the visual can be interpreted specifically literal or metaphorical. The second thing to consider is the learning differences. We have to consider how people are focusing on different components. Are they going on the step by step? Are they going through changes? So they are having to adapt from an old way of doing things to a new way of doing things. Say, if in the workplace people have done things in a certain order, now we're asking them to do things different in a different order. So that's the learning difference is going to play an important role because not everybody is the same, and that we'll talk a little bit later about that when we are talking about the learner analysis. You have to be careful, and we cannot please every single learner. The other thing to consider is that cognitive overload. So the number of distractions we have. A lot of people tend to do things just because they look cool, or a software application allows you to do a lot of things. For example, PowerPoint allows you for transitions, sound effects, background sound, or in some cases people go crazy with balloons, pictures, text, audio, and video, or ticker, like the CNN ticker at the bottom of the screen. So you can do a lot of distraction that can present a lot of information for learners. But if they are not prepared to receive that much and they don't know how to handle it, it can become a cognitive overload. So be careful with that. And then of course the learning styles, as we mentioned before, the how people learn differently depending on what the challenge is for them and what they are resisting to doing. Then comes also the other style, which is the way in which people absorb information. Some people like to read, others like to see pictures, others like to see schematics, others like to watch a video, etc. Others like to try and fail and try and get it right the next time. And then last thing to consider is also things to do so that the learner can feel engaged and can be attentive. In this age where we have so much technology and so many distractions, we have to develop some learning solutions that definitely capture the attention for the learner. I have a person that I follow, Elliot Macy, from the Learning Consortium. You can look him up, you Google him. He's one of the things that he told us one time at one of the conferences was our job is to make the learner hungry. And so how we're going to do that, how are we going to get their attention, how are we going to make them engage in the learning process, that is precisely this last thing to consider. Now, why do we do instructional design, or why do we need to design instruction or learning? Well, number one, if we talk about the learning application in the corporate environment, it is very expensive. Today, when you go out and look for any training or consulting of any sort to do development or to do learning, it is going to be extremely expensive. You can go, for example, a quick thing is how much are you paying for tuition right now? And similarly, if you price a conference, I'll tell you, learning for the conference that I was telling you from Elliot Macy, registration for that is a little bit over $1,500, just the conference. And so all the learning is very expensive, and if you bring it into your organization, it's going to be even more expensive. The other reason why we should consider instructional design, or why you're looking into doing this, which is very valuable, is we have to help the company or the organization or the department identify the problems that can be solved with training. But on this point, I have to tell you, not everything is solved with training, so be careful with that. Training is not a catch-all for everything, although when you are in the workplace, either you have experienced it or you will hear it. So be careful, because training is not the solution for every single problem in the corporate environment. So we also try to lower the cost, or at least to avoid some of the cost. This is where it starts to get a little tricky, because if we're going to be asking for tools that are very expensive, we are not lowering the cost, so it's all relative. And the last one is the return on investment. If a company is spending resources in hiring an instructional designer, or a person to do instructional design, or a person to do design training, they better be getting some return on investment. Higher quality of products, less mistakes, less errors, faster production, less complaints, more efficient throughput of systems or knowledge or products, or the infamous widget, as we have heard metaphorically before. So those are the reasons that we normally want to do instructional design. And of course, there are other reasons, like the needs analysis. If you have gone through the 311 course, you have heard the reason why we need to do a needs analysis. So something important is how we use this terminology, education versus training. There is a big difference between the two, and so sometimes people get really finicky about the definition of training. As a matter of fact, you hear the word trainer tossed around a lot. Oh, we need to talk to our trainer. And so in some cases, some people feel a little bit diminished by it. But regardless of that, really what is important is for us to bring and educate our counterparts in the business environment as to what the difference is between the two. So as you see on the screen, education is an academic person that is prepared for the workforce. So the long-term goal, like what we are doing today. However, training is applying that information at the workplace, so that the short-term goal. So if you are developing something to increase the efficiency, to decrease the errors, you're definitely training. If you're opening a program and people are going sequentially through components until they achieve the end of the program, like our case in the program of education, then you are definitely seeing the difference between the two. So there's a huge difference between those two terms. And that takes us to what you have seen in the book. So this is the probably most famous system of all, the Instructional Systems Design, or ISD as some people call it. The core of it is the ADDIE, or the Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. This system is very known by a lot of instructional designers, trainers, educators, etc. As a matter of fact, if you have done that before, you have heard of it. And if you Google it, you will find a lot of information around it. All of it is pointing to the exact same principle. And that is, we have to, in the instructional design, we have to analyze what the problem is, figure out what the solution is, or like we have talked about before, or you have heard before in the needs analysis, we have to define what is the current state and what is the future or desired state, and what that gap is. Following that process is going to get us the analysis phase. Once we have identified that gap, then we're going to design a solution that is going to help us fill that gap. Whether it is, like I mentioned before, the reduction of mistakes, the improvement of quality, the reduction of issues identified by regulators, etc. And so once we have designed that experience, we have to develop it, right? So if we have talked about learning objectives, this is what we expect people to learn. This is what we hope people are going to get from this experience. Now we have to develop it. So that is a number of things. That's when we get into job aid development, into e-learning design, into tests, quizzes, simulations, case studies, etc. And then of course we get into taking all of that, putting it all together into a nice package for the learner, and then we implement it. So that's when you bring people into the classroom or deploy an e-learning module or a computer-based module, and people go through it, and hopefully they will have learned something, whether it's an interaction with the system again, or better customer experience, or the like. And then the last thing is, not necessarily the least or less important, but then there is the evaluation. We have to make sure we evaluate in different levels. Later we will talk about the Kirkpatrick model, which has 4 different levels of evaluation, but the basic one is, obviously we're going to evaluate the learner. Did the transfer of knowledge take place, and how effectively did it happen? I think everybody can resonate with that because we have been in school for many years. And if you recall, back when we were in grade school, middle school, high school, and even now, in some cases, in actually every case, we take information and then we have to demonstrate that we understood the information, whether it's in the form of a test, a quiz, a design, a final product, etc. In this case, the hat. So keep that in mind. Now, as we move along in this ADDIE process, the one thing to understand is how do we apply it. So this is the traditional sequence of the ADDIE model. We usually analyze first, then we design, then we move into the development, then we begin implementing, and then of course we evaluate. Well, the reality is, in many organizations, that is a luxury people don't have, because it does take time. Imagine point A and point B, point A being the analysis, point B being the evaluation. How long is it going to take us to get from one to another? Especially when you have a company that tells you, I need this solution for a week from today. The design and the development has to be cramming into 1 week. So intentionally, what ends up happening is something a little bit like this, where we analyze and then we design, then we move into the development in a circular, a clockwise manner, as you're seeing. Then we get into the implementation. As we are implementing, we evaluate, and we're evaluating as we're implementing, but we're also evaluating as we're developing, and we are evaluating as we're designing, and also we evaluate as we are analyzing. Here is where you actually begin to see that, number one, ADDIE is not necessarily that sequential in real life. But number two, remember when I talked about Kirkpatrick and 4 different levels of evaluation? Well, this is why. Because the evaluation is going to actually happen at different levels. You have to evaluate how you are communicating with your partners, your business partners, your subject matter experts. Is the transmission of knowledge, so we can design and develop, okay? Are they being pleased with the service we're giving them, etc.? Then we have to evaluate how the learner, when they are going through what we designed and implemented, is working for them. Is it helping them do their job better? Are they doing a better job, etc.? Then we move into the next evaluation, which is, how did the whole experience go? Did we design something that was effective in general, aside from the grades or the scores that learners received? And how did the client perceive our interaction with them? And how well did we design? Did we meet the deadline? So all of those evaluations need to happen essentially at different stages of the ADDIE model, hence this graphic. And then the last thing that I'd like to mention, and you probably saw a reference in the book to iterative processes. And I'd like to introduce you very quickly. We are not going to spend too much time on this, which is the SAM, or the Successive Approximation model. This is a very popular model that was born not too long ago. As a matter of fact, ADDIE is a design or a system that has been in place for many years. I'm talking about, gosh, more than 20 years. SAMS, however, is something very relatively new, modern. It comes from the iteration, the agile. If you have heard the agile system. Essentially what it is an iteration. You do something, and as you're doing that something, you are moving into the design, and then as you are implementing it, you are already designing something else, and so you move into that iteration. In the screen, for example, the start model of that begins with an evaluation. Well, an evaluation is similar in this case to an analysis. Once we have figured out what we need, we go into the design phase, and then we get into the development phase. We evaluate how that is working, and then we end. But this is not the full process, or this is not the full model. So this is one iteration of it. So check this out. The full model essentially proposes this. You're going to define the background, or the reason for doing this. You're going to gather information. You're going to begin defining who your SMEs are, what you're planning to accomplish, what that gap is, what that current state and future state are. That's what they refer as to the preparation phase. Then you move into the iterative design phase, and that's where you can have as many of those as necessary. So when you're doing a project planning, you move into that prototyping, reviewing, and designing. You do a little bit of additional design while all of that is happening, and then you move to the next phase. So when the first iterative design phase is complete, you can go ahead and deploy. So imagine you have 4 concepts that you need to train in an assembly line. The proposition here is that you prototype, review, and design the first one of 4 in an assembly line, and you deploy it. As you're deploying that, you immediately move into the next one. You design again, you prototype that one, you review it, you design it. So basically, the iterative design phase and the iterative development phase, those are happening technically concurrently. As you're rolling out, then you go through the next phase on the example of the assembly line. Then you move into the second piece of your assembly line. You define the prototype, you review, and you design. Then you implement, you evaluate, and then you get back into development, and then you roll it out. And as you're doing that, you move into the third problem of your assembly line, do the same process again, and then you move to the 4th problem of the assembly line. The idea behind this is that you are going to constantly be prototyping, designing, and developing. You are never going to go design the full solution, develop the full solution, and execute the full solution. Instead, you're going to design, develop, and implement parts of the solution. Like the example of the assembly line. If the solution includes 4 pieces, you're going to design, develop, and implement 4 different times concurrently. This tends to be fine for instances where you have subject matter experts that don't have as much time, or when you need a just-in-time approach where the first problem is already looming. You have to have a corrective measure, a corrective training in the next week or so. Then you need to design that quickly. You don't stop and resolve for everything. You need to stop and resolve for that first problem that is looming in the next week or so. Design, develop, implement. As that is out, then you begin with the next one. So that is the difference between the ADDIE and the SAM model, and I don't think either one of them is better than the other. Instead, my recommendation is stick with the ADDIE model because those phases are important. And then as you progress through this course, or maybe as you experience what your current role is at your company, you can decide what is the best course of action. If you want to start and end all in a sequential process, or if you can do the iterative phases as we have on the screen. Okay. So at last, I'm going to leave you with these 4 components, which is going to tee us up for the next components of the course. What are the different pieces of instructional design? Well, for one, you heard me talk about the learners. We have to know them because we are designing a solution they are going to consume. And remember, they consume it differently. We cannot solve for every single way of people consume information, but we have to keep it in mind and make it as generic as possible depending on the group of people we are going to address. Then we have the methodology or the method. How are we going to train? Are we going to have them do a simulation? Are we going to have them sit through a PowerPoint? Are we going to have them sit through a CBT, etc.? Then we are going to consider evaluation. Remember, we're going to visit Kirkpatrick and the 4 levels of evaluation. So that is a big component. We need to evaluate how things are happening. Otherwise, we are never going to be sure to be hitting the mark. And then, of course, last but not least is the objectives. What are we trying to solve for? What we define as the gaps, now we have to clearly define what those gaps are, and that's what we are going to solve for. So I'm going to leave you with the reason for instructional design is definitely because we want to address a problem that generally can be solved by identifying the gaps, which are the objectives, and we have to make sure we design something that the learners or the workers are going to be able to consume in a reasonable amount of time, and that we can evaluate that it was effective. So more to come, but this is definitely getting your feet wet, and I hope this makes sense in relation to what you read in the chapter.